Thank you so much for having me to present my research on how public scrutiny impacts police effort, and I'll be drawing on evidence from arrests and crimes after high-profile police killings. So, um, we are all here today to discuss the increase in violent crime that was witnessed in 2020, a trend that's possibly continuing into 2021. And there are a lot of potential determinants that are being discussed today, but this discussion is happening amongst a backdrop of a peculiar year in 2020, but in particular, one that faced lots of civil unrest and a racial reckoning that happened, particularly associated with policing. And this was touched off by several instances of high-profile police killings, namely the murder of George Floyd. And these questions about whether this intensified scrutiny impacts violent crime are not new. So they've been at least going on since 2014, and it's been termed as the Ferguson Effect. Now, there have been a series of different articles, some that you'll see recently, but ones that have been going back since at least 2014 that talk about how additional community and media scrutiny impacts policing behavior. And this is one example from the Washington Post, but there have been recent examples from the New York Times speaking about how police officers are quitting in droves as a result of additional scrutiny. But I'll be studying a more generalized example about how it affects actual policing behavior in terms of arrests. To provide a little bit of background on what the Ferguson Effect is, it references the death of Michael Brown, an unarmed Black teen, in August of 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. After he was killed by a Ferguson police officer, there was a large increase in community awareness, media coverage, and protests related to policing. This largely led to expansion of the Black Lives Matter movement. And what we saw was there was also an increase in violent crime in 2015 and 2016. Now, this led former FBI Director James Comey to make the comment that and attribute the increase in violent crime to decreased officer activity, saying that there's a chill wind blowing through American law enforcement over the last year, and that chill wind was the increased focus on police officers and policing more generally. Now, in my paper, what I focus on are three main questions. One, which is, do high-profile police killings lead to reductions in arrests for the involved department? And if they do, these, again, are high-profile events. There's a lot going on. There could be changes in policing behavior, but also changes in offending, community cooperation with the police, and even civilian reportings of crime. So in like the totality of the evidence, do we find that's consistent with public scrutiny being the causal channel for the reduction in arrests? And then finally, which is why we're here today, is what are the broad impacts on violent crime or crime more generally? Now, we'll be drawing from data, crowdsourced data from a website called Fatal Encounters. And again, here's a quick definition of officer-involved fatality, which involves the death of a civilian caused by a police officer. And when we look at data from Fatal Encounters, we find that there's over 1,200 officer-involved fatalities or police killings annually. They collect this data through a variety of different methods: Freedom of Information Act requests, web scraping, and paid researchers. And using their estimates of officer-involved fatalities, they're about 7 to 9% of homicides in the US, broadly defined, are a result of officer-involved fatalities. Now, we won't be using all of those for our study today. We'll be only using the high-profile ones, which is a term I've used repeatedly. That means we'll be focusing on the ones that generate 1,000 news articles or more per incident. How I do this is I scraped a news search engine and determined the number of news articles associated with each police killing. Now, the reason we're not using official government data is that still to this day, estimates of the number of police killed, the number of civilians killed by the police are being underreported. Now, what do the characteristics of these high-profile police killings look like? Well, because we're using this high-profile cutoff, ones that are typically discussed in the media align with what we see in our analysis sample. So typically it involves primarily young, male, civilians that are Black, that are shot by police officers. They're typically unarmed and they're not suffering from behavioral health issues, though about a quarter of them do have some behavioral health issues, which we'll discuss later and obviously intersect with the work that Monica was discussing earlier today. Now, we'll be combining that data on officer-involved fatalities with data from the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, which has a near universe of arrests and crime counts that are reported on a monthly basis for most police departments. So we'll be conducting a national analysis. We'll be having over 2,700 police departments, where 52 of them will be experiencing an officer-involved fatality between our sample frame of 2005 and 2016. So we'll be analyzing 72 police killings in total. Now, our analysis will be similar to what is called a difference in difference design. And what that means is we'll be comparing police departments that experience a high-profile police killing versus departments that either experience none between the 2005 and 2016 period, or that experience them but later on in the analysis sample frame. So basically, we're deriving our causal estimate on this idea that the timing of the high-profile police killing is plausibly random. Now, what I'm going to show to you is essentially 9 different difference in difference estimates by arrest category. So these are 9 separate regressions, and they are for each different arrest category and ordered by decreasing level of the social cost of crime. Now, what I'm doing is trying to show how the reductions in arrests may change by crime type. And what we find is that there are no statistically significant reductions in arrests for the more serious offenses. So that includes all of the violent crimes and motor vehicle theft and burglary. However, when we get to theft, what we're starting to see is that there are statistically significant reductions in theft for the 1.5 years after jurisdiction experiences a high-profile police killing. And that reduction in theft is about 7%. So you can think of change in log points as essentially percent divided by 100. And when we focus on the lower level arrests, now these are the least serious offenses. They're also the ones that police officers have the most discretion in choosing whether or not to intervene, such as marijuana sale, disorderly conduct, and marijuana possession. We see substantial and significant reductions in arrests of around 15%. If we were to look at the same figure, but look in terms of violent crime, what we see is almost a flip side, where the increases associated with a high-profile police killing is we see in the aftermath of high-profile police killing, there are substantial increases in violent crime. Now, there's large increases in murder of almost 15%. We see that in robbery of around 12%. And there are also increases that are smaller but still significant of motor vehicle theft and theft. And this is incredibly important to realize that although in the aftermath of a high-profile police killing, the reductions are concentrated in the least serious arrests, we still see increases in the most serious crimes. So to summarize, what we find are the reductions are exclusively associated with lower level arrests. I didn't show you this, but there's a lot of work in the paper trying to disentangle where these reductions are coming from. It turns out they occur for both Black and white suspects. Higher profile police killings result in larger effects. And the totality of the evidence points that public scrutiny is the mechanism that's really driving officer effort. And when we analyze how these effects change over time, we find that the declines in the least serious arrests are persistent, and they occur for at least 1.5 years after the high-profile police killing. And when I say persistent, I mean that for marijuana possession, for example, we're seeing reductions of over 30% 1.5 years after these high-profile police killings. And that likely negates theories that officers are just being reassigned from protests to deal with this. However, it may reflect a change that officers are being pulled or choosing to engage less in street-level policing and deciding to stay in their patrol vehicles. We also witnessed large increases in murders and robberies. And though it seems obvious to directly pinpoint them associated with the reductions in policing effort and saying, oh, perhaps the offending response is reacting to a lower apprehension risk judged by the lower amounts of arrest, it could also be the case that they could be reacting to the police killing itself, resulting in a reduction in legal compliance. And this is a large discussion where no one's been quite able to disentangle these two effects yet. Now, what about policy takeaways? What we find in this study is actually consistent what others find with other oversight policies that impose additional monitoring costs on police officers. So what I'm thinking about here are court mandated monitoring from the ACLU or Department of Justice pattern or practice investigations. So we should be wary when imposing these additional monitoring costs, or at least exploring ways in which they can mitigate some of the reductions in arrests and also increases in crime. What we also see is that 1/4 of the high-profile police killings involve civilians that are facing some behavioral health issues. Now, it is important to evaluate how new changes such as having police officers pair with mental health professionals, or perhaps just having more mental health services more generally, such as Monica's presentation, may increase or decrease the level of officer-involved fatalities. We also see that 60% of these deaths involve unarmed civilians, so it's important to understand policies that reduce police use of force. Now, the recent literature has shown a couple different ways. One is increasing the racial and gender diversity of the police department, increasing procedural training for police officers, and delaying the age of entry for when civilians can become police officers. And hopefully, with all of this, we can figure out a way to reduce the number of high-profile police killings and in turn, reduce their associated increases with violent crime.